On a rain-slick October night in 1995, the cul-de-sac held its breath. At 3:12 a.m., a child's window learned to breathe. The streetlights flickered and hummed like tired insects trapped in glass. Puddles caught the glow and shivered when the wind pushed at them. A newspaper lay soaked and flattened on the curb, the ink running until the photos looked like wet shadows. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then thought better of it. On the second house from the corner, upstairs, a small square of light showed a room that should have been asleep. The glass wore fog from a small person's breath, then lost it to cold air. The curtain lifted and fell as if someone unseen were standing there, touching the edge with careful fingers. Inside, the bed waited with a My Little Pony comforter folded back like a page someone forgot to finish. A nightlight glowed in the shape of a pink star. It made a dim halo on the wall and left the corners of the room to the dark. Downstairs, the kitchen clock ground past 3:12 and then 3:13 with a sound like a dull blade. The mother counted each second without meaning to, feeling them scrape along her nerves. She felt the house complain under her steps. Every board she crossed had a story, and each story now seemed to ask the same question: where is she? The refrigerator sighed and clicked off. Somewhere deep in the walls, pipes made a faint knock, as if someone were tapping from inside. The mother called her daughter's name once, then again, the second time softer. She had meant to whisper it only to herself, as if a whisper could reach a sleeping child better than a shout. But the room upstairs gave no answer. The air moved in and the air moved out, and the window breathed like a slow animal. The father held the phone so tight it squeaked. His voice tried to carry, then broke, then came back again on a path worn raw by fear. "My daughter is gone," he told the 911 operator. He said it once. He said it twice. He said it a third time as if the words themselves could force time backward to the moment before they were true. The operator asked questions in a steady voice that fought the panic. How old? What does she look like? When did you last see her? Is there an open door, an open window, a chair by the sill, a screen cut or lifted? He answered in pieces, messy pieces that did not fit. The operator told him to stay on the line, to keep calm, to keep talking. How do you keep calm when a room that held your whole heart suddenly holds only a dip in the blankets and a cooling pillow? He told her about the comforter, how it was folded back. He did not mean to, but the detail would not leave his mouth. The mother reached the top of the stairs, her feet bare, her robe trailing. She felt the cool air before she saw the open latch. She touched the glass, felt the breath she wished were still there, and in that small warmth felt the whole weight of the night. The curtain brushed her knuckles, damp with fog. On the dresser, the tiny red and white tape recorder lay where it always did, its plastic face shining with a film of dust she had meant to wipe earlier. A little sticker of a rainbow was peeling off. The bed looked like a sentence that stopped in the middle. A stuffed horse had slipped to the floor and lay on its face. The mother gathered the horse, as if returning it to the bed could fix the shape of the world, then set it back down because the world would not be fixed that way. "Izzy," she said. She had never heard her daughter's name sound so small. The first police car found the address by the smear of blue and red on the wet street. 2 officers climbed out and bent into the wind, their jackets flapping. They moved through the house with a soft speed, as if haste might break the thin glass of whatever clue still floated in the air. A detective in a dark coat arrived a few minutes later, boots leaving clean prints on the tile that the mother would never be able to mop away in her mind. She introduced herself as Detective Lena Hart. Her partner, Ruiz, took notes, quick lines on a page that would soon fill with more questions than answers. They asked the parents to sit. The parents stood anyway. Sitting felt like giving up a step. Rooms turned inside out. Drawers slid inside. The back door was locked. The front door was locked. Every window latch was checked by a gloved hand except the one that stood open as if it had been taught a trick. The frame showed no splinters. The paint by the lock had a bright scratch where something had rubbed hard but not hard enough. Outside, behind the garage, Detective Hart found the old side gate. Its rusted lock was scored but not broken, the scratches pale and fresh against brown metal. She ran her thumb along them and felt the powder flake. Her eyes followed the fence line to the corner where a hedge slumped in the rain. A narrow path of trampled ivy led to a strip of mud that was already collapsing under water. Rain made a drywall of the ground and wrote over every footprint as fast as it could. A K-9 unit arrived with quiet focus. The dogs waited at the door, fog huffing from their mouths like engine exhaust. An officer knelt on the bedroom floor and held out a small shirt, then a pillowcase, then the stuffed horse. The dog breathed deep, eyes bright, tail still. He moved toward the hall, then the stairs, then the back door. His handler murmured encouragement, voice low, like a prayer or a spell. They crossed the lawn, traced the fence, squeezed through the hedge, and reached the street beyond. The dog pulled left, then right, circling to catch the thread that fear had left hanging. He found it, followed it, and took the team to the corner where a metal grate shone like wet teeth. Water rushed below, black as night without stars. The dog's nose moved over the holes, hunted for more, then faltered. He turned in a tight loop, tried again, and then, with a soft whine, lifted his head and looked up at his handler. The scent ended at the storm drain, as if the night itself had swallowed a child. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas and under nothing at all. They wrapped their arms across their chests as if to keep something inside from breaking loose. They spoke in the careful voices people use when they hope they will not need to remember their words later. A woman in a robe said she heard a truck at 2:30, or maybe it was 1:30. A man in slippers said his dog barked at nothing, but it barked at nothing often. A teenager with wet hair said he saw headlights on, no, off, no, on and off, like someone was signaling. Every story gave a shape to the fear, and every shape dissolved when Detective Hart pressed her pencil against it. Behind the garage, she measured the distance from the path to the gate and wrote down the number, even though she knew what rain did to numbers. She told Ruiz to bag the lock, the shavings, a few leaves that might hold the print of a boot. He did, and the evidence bags shone like fish in the porch light. Back upstairs, the mother stood beside the small bed. The room looked wrong now, as if it had been quickly staged as a memory. She saw the little tape recorder again and lifted it with careful hands. It was heavier than she remembered. She pressed play, but the tiny wheels turned and gave only a hush and a pop, then silence. The detective held out a bag. The mother stared at the bag as if it were a trap and then slid the recorder inside. "We'll return it when we can," Detective Hart said, her voice gentler than her face. The mother nodded. Around them, Ruiz lifted the comforter and let it fall. He looked at the window latch from a dozen angles. He wrote down the time. The clock downstairs said 3:41 now. Time had moved without asking anyone's permission. The father tried to explain how a house could be sleeping and then, in a breath, not. He told the detectives about the movie they'd watched. He told them about the hot cocoa, the marshmallows that made the steam smell like sugar. He told them how their daughter had yawned and asked if it was okay to leave the window open a crack because she liked to hear rain. He told them they said yes because it was October and the cold was the kind that felt clean. He told them how they checked on her at midnight and she was turned on her side, one hand under her cheek, breathing with a soft whistle that always made the mother smile. He told them he woke at 3:12 to the sound of a floorboard he couldn't name and a feeling like a hand on his heart. He walked into the hallway and saw the door open, saw the bed turn to a question mark. He called out. He called out again. He ran downstairs to throw every lock, to close every door, as if closing the house after the fact could hold back the dark. His voice cracked on the parts of the story that were too sharp to say. Detective Hart listened to all of it and kept her face steady. She had a daughter too, but she did not think about that now. She thought about the lock scratched and not broken, the drain that ate the trail, the curtain that moved, the window that breathed. She walked the yard with a flashlight, short steps to keep the beam steady, and found tire tracks pressed into the strip of mud by the fence. But the tracks were one long smear, no tread left, just a gray memory of a pattern. She crouched by the gate and looked down the alley where the wet pavement turned the world into a smear of lights. The town was quiet in the way towns are quiet at 3 in the morning, each house holding its own night like a secret. She made a small mark on her pad and went back inside. Rumors grew legs by dawn. The paper boy saw police tape and pedaled slower to drink it in. The morning news picked up the story and said words like "vanished" and no signs of struggle and ongoing investigation. At the corner store, a man in a baseball cap said he never trusted that cul-de-sac because the streetlights failed all the time, as if darkness itself had something to do with it. A woman buying coffee rolled her eyes at him but kept her voice hushed. The town turned the night over in its mouth like a hard candy, letting it dissolve into a sweetness of shared fear. They talked about the rusted lock behind the garage. Some said the marks meant someone tried and failed. Others said the marks were old, and the new ones were just where the detective's glove had scraped it. A loud voice said you don't need a gate when a window is right there, and someone else shushed him because the mother's sister had just walked in. The house became a hallway of questions. Every person who entered added a layer of dust the mother would never see but would always feel. A technician powdered the window frame and studied the results under a light that made everything look cold. Smears, he said to no one, to everyone. Gloves or wet hands. He peeled a strip of tape and lifted a faint loop that might belong to anyone or to no one at all. Another team cataloged the contents of the room. They took photographs of the small shoes by the closet, the row of hairbands on the dresser like tiny colored halos, the drawing on the wall of a horse with a long, impossible tail. In the living room, an officer with a soft voice asked the parents to think of any cars they noticed on the street lately, any strangers, any packages, any calls that hung up, any light bulbs that kept burning out for no reason. The parents stared at him and tried to drag a useful answer out of the fog. By noon, the rain slowed and then stopped, leaving the world packed and heavy. The storm drain gurgled and then sighed, like a throat clearing after a long cry. The handler brought the dog back one more time. He let the dog smell the shirt again and brought him along the fence, across the alley, and to the grate. The dog put a paw on the metal, an old habit he had when a trail ended at a point he could not cross. The handler did not let him linger there. He pulled him back, turned him around, and tried the other direction. The dog's ears tipped, then flattened. He was doing his best. He knew his best was not enough this time. The tape recorder, now labeled and logged, waited on a table in a room that smelled like toner and coffee. A fingerprint on the side turned out to be the girl. Another, smudged, meant nothing. A detective pressed play and heard nothing but hiss and a pop and the faint chew of the tape's age. Someone wrote "no audio" on a line, then added a question mark, then crossed out the question mark because questions did not go in that kind of file. Later, when the house grew too quiet, the mother would ask for the box of toys back. She would not want to, but she would want to. She would stack the stuffed animals in a plastic bin and tuck the tape recorder on top, as if it were resting there. She would close the lid and press until it clicked. She would set it in a closet by the hall and then close that door too. It would take her years to open either again. Days became a week, and then a month the way a bruise fades, slow at the edges and tender at the center. Posters went up with a school photo. In it, the girl's eyes were bright and certain, a look that made strangers stop and look twice. People taped those faces to their refrigerators and then stopped seeing them after a while. A tip line rang and rang. Most calls led nowhere. A woman swore she saw the girl at a truck stop 3 towns over, but her story collapsed under questions. A man confessed to a dozen crimes at once, most of which had not happened. A white van was reported in every neighborhood. The van, when stopped, held a man who worked nights and a lunch pail that smelled like tuna. He cried when the officer told him why he had been pulled over. The case grew folders with tabs in colors that did not make the pages lighter. Winters came. Snow pressed the hedges down so they looked like sleeping animals. Icicles grew on the gutter and fell in a soft crash that always made the mother flinch. Springs came. Daffodils pushed up next to the mailbox and bloomed yellow like small suns that could not light the inside of the house. Summers came. Kids rode their bikes in circles, chasing one another with rubber band guns, calling rules out loud to make them feel safe. Autumns came. The date carved itself into her, then into him, then into the town. Each year someone placed a single flower at the base of the stop sign at the corner. No one ever said who. It leaned and browned and died and still meant everything. Detective Hart aged into the case. She kept it on the top shelf of her mind where the light was better. She visited the house on anniversaries and sat with the mother and father and sometimes said nothing at all. She walked the alley again and stood by the storm drain and listened. Once, she climbed down with a maintenance crew when they opened a section for repairs. She walked the tunnel with a flashlight and saw writing on the wall, chalk and marker and old paint, kids' names layered over one another like graffiti fossils. She found a small pink plastic ring half buried in grit. It was nothing. It was something. She slipped it into an evidence bag anyway and drove back in silence. She learned to carry two truths at once, that people could vanish, and that people left traces too small to see until you knew where to look. The town changed its shape around the loss. Families moved in and moved out. New kids learned the story from kids who had grown up thinking the street had a shadow that never moved. Parents told their children not to cut through the alley at night, then at dusk, then at all. A boy dared his friends to stand on the storm drain for 10 seconds and count backwards. He lasted 7 before jumping off, laughing with a sound too loud for the small space. A teacher lined her window sills with small potted plants and told her class, "Things grow even when it's hard to see." A mechanic across from the grocery store replaced more locks than usual, and each time he turned a key in a new cylinder he thought about that scored, unbroken metal behind the garage. The house kept most of its shape. Paint peeled, then it was repainted. A new roof went on after a storm peeled the old one like a scab. The nightlight stayed in the drawer by the bed, even after the bed was moved to the room that once had been a home office. The tape recorder stayed in the box. Sometimes the mother opened the closet and reached in and touched the lid and then pulled her hand back as if it were hot. The father started to fix small things and then stopped halfway because he forgot what a house was for. Their steps grew quiet. They spoke without moving their mouths much. They learned the long, slow language of waiting. At the grocery store, the cashier knew not to ask how they were. The pastor knew not to say the wrong kind of hope. The detective knew not to promise what she could not deliver. A boy who had been 15 when the girl vanished was 25 now and worked at the gas station. He watched the parents pull in and tried to think of something good to say, something that did not sound like a news anchor or a greeting card. He ended up washing their windshield twice. He made the glass so clean the world outside looked sharper and colder, and he stood there with the squeegee dripping at his feet, feeling like he had broken something and not knowing how to fix it. The case turned to winter the way a creek turns to ice, hard on the surface, slow underneath. Leads kept a dull glow long after they should have burned out. A letter arrived once with words cut from magazines, a crude collage that claimed to know everything. It knew nothing. A tip came from 2 states away and took 3 days to check and 1 hour to end. The storm drain became a thing people mentioned with a shrug, then with a sigh, then not at all. But every time it rained hard, and the grate coughed and gurgled, the town listened without saying it was listening. The father kept the 911 recording for a while, then deleted it, then asked if it could be recovered, then let it go. He could hear it anyway when he closed his eyes, the operator's steady voice, his own voice each time it broke into that sentence he never wanted to learn by heart. The mother sometimes stood at the window at 3:12 a.m. with her hand on the glass. The cool slid into her palm and she let it, as if her skin could carry a cold that did not have to live in her chest. She whispered a name that still felt warm in her mouth. She told the night small truths. She told it bigger ones. She told it to stop listening. Of course it did not. Kids grew into adults who still stepped a little wider past the alley. The old man who walked at dawn every day finally did not, and his house went empty and then went bright again when a young family moved in with a baby who liked to kick his feet against the stroller tray. The mechanic retired and sold the shop to a cousin who brought new signs and a shiny coffee machine. Detective Hart trained younger detectives and passed this case down the line with more notes than anyone wanted to read and fewer answers than anyone could accept. She kept a copy of the photo on her corkboard. The girl never aged in it. Hart did. And still, the town kept things it did not say. A boy had come home late that night with mud on his shoes and said nothing. A woman had lied to herself about the time she heard a car door close because she hated the turn her thought would take if she told the truth. A man had fixed a gate the week before and found a glove that was too small for his hand and too large for a child. He tossed it in the trash because that is what you do with gloves you find by fences. That was the same day the streetlight at the corner failed and came back and failed again, passing the dark hand to each other like a baton in a slow race. Years later, if you drove that street on a wet October night and looked up at the second house from the corner, you might see your own reflection in the glass. You might see the faint bloom of your breath if you rolled your window down and leaned close. You might notice the curtain lift and fall in a draft you could not feel. It would be nothing. You would tell yourself, and you would be right. You would be wrong, too, in a way that would tug at you as you turned the corner and the house slipped out of your mirror. You would tell yourself this town had made peace with what it did not know. But peace is not the right word for a quiet that deep. On many nights, long after the last patrol had rolled by and the last porch light had clicked off, the house settled and creaked as houses do. A refrigerator motor kicked in. A pipe tapped once and went still. The clock in the kitchen dragged minute hands from one number to the next. If you were there, standing on the cold tile, you might feel a breath that is not a person's breath but a room remembering. You might put your hand to the window and feel nothing and feel everything. And you might understand, in a way that has no words, how a window that once learned to breathe never really forgets. On a gray afternoon in 2006, a roll-up door rattled upward and let the past spill out. The storage unit exhaled dust and cold air, and at the back of it, under a blanket, the toy that remembered waited to be heard. He had come alone because there are some rooms a marriage cannot hold. The father stood in the square of light like a man at the mouth of a cave. Boxes leaned against boxes, their inked labels faded to soft ghosts. Winter COATS, good DISHES, school art, IZZY, room. He had told himself he would be practical, that he would sort and donate and shorten the inventory of grief to something he could lift. But his hands found the box he knew too well. The cardboard gave under his fingers with a tired sigh. He pulled aside tissue paper that smelled like old paperbacks and damp carpeting. There it was, red and white plastic, the tiny rainbow sticker still peeling at the edge. He pressed play because he could not press play. Static bloomed like a far storm. He flinched, then leaned closer, his ear bent the way you bend toward a secret. For a moment there was nothing but faint hiss and the soft grind of gears that were never meant to wait this long. Then a fragile voice found its way through the snow. He heard the lift of it, the scratch of it, the way she always said her name like a gift she was handing to the room. He swallowed and tried not to breathe too loudly. Testing, the little voice said, and then came other sounds. The sounds that had been in the room in 1995 but not in his head, not in anyone's head. A bell rang 3 notes, clear, rising, falling, rising again, the pattern made for a railroad crossing on the east spur. It was not the main line's blunt two-tone. It was the old spur's 3-step, the one only trains to the grain silos carried after dark. After that came a staccato rattle, mechanical, persistent, the rhythm of an ancient HVAC fan with a bent blade, the kind that shook a whole building like a cough. And under both, like a watermark, a thin voice cut through, cheerful and tired, a late-night DJ sliding into a new hour. "You're on with KLMR after 2, the voice said, and then the call sign stretched out, musical and plain. The father felt his own voice scrape against his throat. After 2, not midnight, not 1. After 2. Press stop with a shaky thumb. He pressed play again and let the 3 notes cut him in a new place. At the mouth of the storage unit, a truck clanked past on the lot and made the air vibrate, a cheap, modern echo to the old song on the tape. A small thing, that tape. But now it felt heavy as a map. He placed it back in the box just for a second and then took it out again, afraid it would go quiet if he let go. He closed up the unit in a daze, the metal door rolling down like an eyelid. He drove to the police station without turning on the radio because the wrong voice would feel like a lie. He asked for Detective Hart. When she stepped into the lobby, he held up the toy the way you hold a found bird, careful, hopeful, not quite believing in its wings. They took him to a room with a long table and a humming light. Hart's hair had more gray than he remembered, but her eyes held the same steady attention he had leaned on for years. Ruiz set a small evidence tray on the table like a plate at a quiet meal. The father placed the recorder on it. "Play it," he said, more plea than instruction. Hart nodded, shut the door, and brought in a portable player the lab used for field checks. "Once," she said. "Then we'll secure it and do this right." They listened together. At the first 3 notes of the crossing bell, Hart's head tilted. At the rattling fan, Ruiz looked up. At the DJ's call sign, after 2, Hart put a finger to her lips, not to silence anyone but to steady the room. The toy went into an evidence bag with a label and 2 signatures. The father watched the ink scratch his name and thought about how many times a pen had tried to make sense of his loss. Hart called the audio lab while Ruiz filled out the chain of custody form. "Yes," she said into the phone, "unique frequency pattern, likely a crossing bell. There's also HVAC noise, very old, cyclic, and a DJ call sign. We need a spectral breakdown. We need everything." She paused, listened, and said, "Yes, right away." The lab lived in the building's quiet belly. The door opened with a buzz and a click, and the room smelled like ozone and coffee. Screens glowed with waves and graphs. A woman in a denim jacket looked up from a keyboard. Her name was Mara Patel, and she wore the calm of a person who can hear what other people miss. "Give me the patient," she said softly, and smiled at the recorder as if it were a person who had finally decided to talk. She set it on a clean pad, gloved hands gentle. "We'll take a digital image of the tape first," she told Hart and the father. "Then we'll listen the slow way." Hours in that room moved like a river. Mara's screens filled with blue-green bands and sharp red teeth. She ran the tape at normal speed, then at half, then at quarter, translating noise into pictures and back again. She peeled layers like paint. She showed them how the static wasn't nothing. It held tiny peaks that could reveal a room size. The echo of the girl's voice against a wall told the lab how far the nearest surface was. The type of echo told them the wall was not plaster, not wood, but tile or concrete, hard and cold. Humidity softened certain frequencies. The way the hiss sagged pointed to wet air. "That's river fog," Mara said, not like a guess, but like a verdict. She circled a downward curve with her cursor and wrote hum on the screen. She isolated the crossing bell's 3 notes and laid them out side by side. "Not a generic bell," she said. "Every bell ages its own way. See how the second note is slightly flat? That's a chip somewhere. And the timing is off by a hair, like a hand that's been bumped. If we can get a sample from the East Spur, we can match it." Hart was already dialing the railroad company. "We'll need access to the East Spur bells," she said. "The ones by the silos." The HVAC rattle turned out to be a school exam of the old machine. Mara smiled a little at the pattern. "Bent blade," she said. "Or a broken mount. It's not fast, so not a small apartment unit. That's a big one, commercial. The rattle frequency tells us the fan size. 10 blades, large cage. That's not many buildings on the river, old warehouses. The municipal bathhouse had one until they closed it." Ruiz glanced up. "Abandoned bathhouse," he repeated. "On the river. Padlock went missing the week she vanished." He did not have to look it up. The detail had lived in his notes for 10 years. An odd pebble he'd tripped over and pocketed because he didn't know if it mattered. Mara rewound to the DJ's voice and let it roll. She slowed the tape until the call sign sounded like a whale song. She sped it up until it snapped. "KLMR," she said. "Late night DJ, after 2. She tapped another screen and pulled up an archive directory. The station kept records the way some people keep diaries, not for anyone else but because time is real. A few calls later, a man with a thin laugh told Ruiz that in 1995, KLMR only ran the after 2 sign-off before certain shows. a quiet set they called Night Tides that played after 2 a.m. on Thursdays and Sundays. We weren't much then, the man admitted. Our transmitter had a cough. It carried best along the river and died under the hills. Ruiz wrote "Thu Sun" in his square block script. They built a map on a whiteboard no one had used in months. Hart drew the river in gray marker. Ruiz added the east spur in blue. Mara dotted locations of grain silos in black and marked the radio transmitter in green. Around the map, they taped printouts of the bell's frequency pattern, the HVAC's rattle, the humidity curve of sound, the DJ. After 2 call. A map from noise, Mara said, and the phrase hung in the room like a breath they could all see. Hart drew a circle around the stretch of river that got the best signal at that hour, adjusted for fog, adjusted for the low transmitter. She drew another circle around the range where a crossing bell on the east spur could be heard with that much clarity and that specific delay. She drew a third around the buildings old enough to have a 10-blade fan on a cage that rattled like that. The circles overlapped in a rough triangle. At its base sat the abandoned bathhouse. Someone had written, "Padlock missing," in the margin of an old file. Ruiz wrote it again in thick letters like he could keep it from vanishing. They went to the tracks first. The east spur looked tired, rails rusty at the edges like coins left in a fountain. A railroad technician named Lou met them in an orange vest. "We don't get much traffic here anymore," he said. "Just the silos and sometimes a maintenance run." Hart asked to hear the bell. Lou flipped a switch and the crossing came alive. 3 notes rose into the afternoon, the second a hair low, the timing just late enough to feel human. Mara held up a small recorder to capture the sound. Back at the lab, she overlaid the 2 bells like tracing paper, the ridges lined up. "Same bell," she said. "Or same model, same age, same chip, but like fingerprints the age speaks." Lou nodded. "That chip been there as long as I can remember. We patched around it, budget never let us replace the whole head." He scratched his cheek and added, "We had a storm last month, knocked it out, I fixed it, but in '95, it sounded like this." They went to the radio station, too. KLMR lived in a brick building with a mural on the side of a guitar and a river that looked more like a ribbon. Inside, walls were lined with CDs, then tapes, then calendars. An old DJ named Lucky leaned back in a squeaky chair and pushed his cap up with a smudged finger. "Night Tides," he said when Ruiz asked. "That was me and Sheila, every Thursday and every Sunday, 2 to 4. We said the call sign in a way management hated. We made it sing a little. After 2 you could do what you wanted, fewer ears to complain." He played them a recording from an archive box, a 1995 aircheck that smelled like attic. The call sign rose and fell like the one on the toy. "We only aired that tag after 2, Lucky said. And we only recorded Friday shows once a month, storage, but Night Tides, that was live." He wrote a list of the dates in October '95 that were Thursdays and Sundays. Hart circled one with a thumbprint. October 15 had been a Sunday. The bathhouse squatted by the river like an animal that had decided not to move for a very long time. The windows were high and set with old glass that had gone wavy. The doors were thick and took 2 hands to pull, but now they were chained and padlocked. The chain looked new. The padlock did not. Hart crouched and examined the edges with a small light. Once in 1995, a park worker had reported the padlock missing for a week. It had reappeared on a Monday with a new coat of grime and a scratch where someone had filed a number off. The father had not known then. He knew now and could not unknow it. Ruiz found the maintenance box mounted on the wall. The key was supposed to be inside. The box was supposed to be sealed with a little lead tag stamped with the city seal. The tag was there, dented, and very clean. They cut the padlock with a bolt cutter. The chain slid down with a tired clank. Inside, the air was sweet with old chlorine and something else that sat on the tongue like pennies. Tiles spread across the floor, most cracked, a few missing, the rest grimy in a pattern that tracked human feet. The old HVAC unit lay in a metal cage above the showers like a sleeping machine. Mara tilted her head and smiled without humor. 10 blades, she said. "See the cage, and look at that mount. It's off by a 1/4 inch. That would rattle like a drawer with a loose screw." Hart imagined the sound running under a tiny voice. The father put a hand against a tile column and felt cool sink into his palm like water. They found writing on the wall in marker, Sharpie strokes from bored teenagers who had broken in before the city spent money on chains. Most of it was names and dates, promises that someone loved someone else forever, the word forever written by a hand that had not been tested. In a corner low near the lockers, they found a child's drawing pressed into grime by a fingertip, a horse with a long, impossible tail, the same as the one on a bedroom wall once. The father stared until the line swam. "You can't know that's hers," Hart said gently. "Lots of kids draw horses that way." He nodded as if she had told him the weather. In the pump room under the stairs, they found a nest of wrappers and a bottle of water so old the plastic had gone soft. They found the scuffed mark of a chair leg against concrete, two marks side by side like someone had dragged a thing here, then dragged it back. They found a silver lock washer that did not match any bolt in this room. Hart held it in her palm. "From a fan cage," Mara said. "It should sit here," and she pointed at an empty slot on the rattle's mount. The washer had broken off and landed under the stairs where no one swept. Ruiz put it in a bag and wrote the date carefully. They took photographs until the light in the windows went thin and gray. They brought in a dog that did not find a scent, and a drone the city had just bought that made a noise like a large bee. The drone took video of the vents and returned with dust. Outside, fog rolled off the river in slow curls that looked like breath if you had the kind of heart that needed metaphors. The father stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the water move. His hands were cold. He did not put them in his sleeves. He wanted to feel something he could name. Interviews began again, the long parade of faces and stories that had powered the first months in 1995 and then had fallen away. Hart and Ruiz knocked on doors and sat in living rooms with stale coffee and polite photos of smiling children. They asked who worked near the river that fall. They asked who had keys to the old bathhouse, and who had copied them, and who had slipped into the pool area after hours to drink or kiss, or do the other things young people always found a way to do. They asked about the East Spur and who had a reason to drive that way at 2 in the morning. They asked the man who had been the bathhouse's caretaker in '95. His name was Silas, and his hands shook when he lit a cigarette. He had said the padlock was missing that week. He had said it without any force a decade ago, like it was a small thing. Now, under Hart's gaze, he said he wasn't sure. Maybe it had been the week after. Maybe it was a month. "Memory does that," Hart said. "It shifts. It tries to protect you." He nodded, grateful for an excuse his face did not quite accept. The maintenance log for city parks should have been a dull, honest book, a list of repairs and purchases and complaints about a budget that never got bigger. When Hart asked for the week of October 15, 1995, she was told the binder was missing. "Checked out for audit last year," the new facilities manager said, flipping through a stack of other binders that stood like unhelpful soldiers. "Never came back." She smiled without showing her teeth. The father watched Hart's jaw move. "Find me who checked it out," Hart said. "Find me the initials. I want the paper trail, however short." The initials belonged to a deputy in the department who had retired 5 months ago. He remembered the binder, sure. He remembered taking it home to catch up. He did not remember where it went after that. He had a shed, he said. He had a lot of sheds. He laughed. It was the wrong sound in the wrong room. A neighbor's story changed under pressure, the way metals bend when heat and hammer meet. Back in 1995, Mr. Brandt from the corner house had told police he was out of town that weekend for a fishing trip with his brother. When Hart stopped by now, his living room smelled like frying oil and lemon cleaner. He said the same thing at first, voice flat with practice. Hart let him talk, then laid the new map on his coffee table. She pointed to the triangle of overlap, to the bathhouse, to the East Spur, to the radio's reach. "We have the bell," she said. "We have the fan, we have the call sign, we have the fog." He stared at the drawn river as if it might rise and run over his shoes. "I drove by there," he said finally. "I was back by 2. Brother dropped me at home. I couldn't sleep. I went for a drive. There was a car by the bathhouse, dark sedan, lights off, then on, then off. I thought kids. I didn't want to be the nosy old man. I went home. I was back by 3. "Why didn't you say this in '95? Hart asked. Her voice was calm but carried weight, like a hand on a shoulder you cannot ignore. He rubbed his forehead. Everyone was so raw, he said. I didn't want to point the police at some kids and have them be innocent. I didn't want to be wrong. Hart let the silence sit. Being wrong is different, she said quietly, than being quiet. He nodded and stared down at his hands. They found the brother. He confirmed part of the story. He had dropped Mr. Brandt off around 2, maybe a little later. They had argued over bait. The brother had laughed when he said it. Stupid to fight over worms, he said. He remembered the fog in the river bottoms that night. He remembered the way his wipers clicked low, then high, then low again, the rhythm settling in his ears. He did not remember a car by the bathhouse. He drove home a different way. The bathhouse caretaker's apprentice in '95, a kid named Aaron then, now a man whose face had learned worry, said something that made Ruiz sit up. The fan, Aaron said after they sat in a diner and pushed eggs around plates, made a rattle only when it was humid, like it was trying harder and didn't like it. That week there was fog every night. I remember because I had to mop water off the locker room floor in the morning. It sneaks in around the windows, the wet. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. We used to say the building had asthma. Ruiz wrote down asthma and underlined it even though it wasn't evidence, just a human way to say a machine was struggling. Later, in the lab, Mara smiled at the word. Asthma is a good instrument, she said. You can tune it. The railroad sent logs of trains that ran the East Spur in October 1995. There were not many, one on October 12. One on October 15, pulling late, the conductor making a note in the margin. Fog thick at river, bell sticky. The conductor's name was Willis. He lived 3 towns over now, worked at a hardware store, wore a name tag that had to be replaced every 2 months because the W kept rubbing off. He remembered the bell. He remembered tuning his ear to it because it told him the crossing was live when the fog made all the world feel unplugged. 3 notes, he said. Seconds always a bit wrong, like a song someone forgot how to sing right. He remembered a car by the bathhouse, too. Lights off, he said. I thought lovers or kids or nobody. He looked at the father and flinched. I didn't think. The DJ Lucky remembered a caller that night, a man with a low voice who asked for a song that played on night tides if you stayed up late enough to know the code. Lighthouse, the man had said. Play Lighthouse. It was an old tune about a beacon that kept shining even when nobody was looking. Lucky had queued it up and said the call sign again, because he liked how it sounded writing that song. He did not remember more. He did not remember numbers, only the shapes of nights like fog shapes. He sat with Hart in the studio as the afternoon sun came through the dirty glass and made the dusk glow, and he told her all the stories that felt close to the one she needed. She listened and took what she could. Piece by piece, a path formed, as if someone had walked it years ago and the grass had finally decided to lie down. The tape didn't just remember, it pointed. It pointed to air that grew heavy near water. It pointed to metal that rang 3 notes out of tune. It pointed to a fan that shook a tile room so hard it seemed to breathe. It pointed to a door that had worn 2 padlocks like jewelry, one that went missing and one that came later. It pointed to a man who had driven by and said nothing, and a man who had tuned his ear to a bell, and a man who had asked for a song about a light. It pointed, too, at the spaces between things, the missing maintenance log, the dented lead tag, the lock washer under a stair. The father went home each night to a kitchen that lived in the soft light of a lamp that didn't know how to be brave. He didn't turn on the overheads. He sat at the table and looked at the chair across from him, and tried to see the person who had once filled it with laughter and questions about horses that could fly. He placed the pink star nightlight the detectives had returned years ago on the table and plugged it in. Its glow made a small circle like a campfire you could warm your hands at only if you were very small. He held the tape recorder sometimes. He did not press play again. He had heard enough to turn a blank wall into a door. Detective Hart slept less. When she did sleep, she dreamed of waves that were sound waves and water waves at the same time. She dreamed of a 3-note bell that rang not outside, but somewhere in the rooms of her chest. She dreamed of her own daughter's window and woke up standing by it, hand on the glass. In the morning, she went to the office early and walked past the whiteboard and laid her palm against the circle where the bathhouse sat like a target someone had drawn in pencil. "Hold," she said under her breath. "Hold still." The city found the missing maintenance binder in one of the retired deputies' sheds under Christmas lights and a broken lawn mower. It had water damage at the edges, but the pages held. The week of October 15 had a line drawn through one entry in a rush, the ink darker, the hand shakier. "REPLACED padlock," it read. "Old one, missing. Replacement temp from silo shop." There was a signature no one could cleanly read and a note in the margin that only said, "Talk to E." Hart and Ruiz took the binder like it was a baby nobody wanted to hold wrong. E turned out to be Earl, the man who ran the welding shop by the silos. He was 80 now and still smelled like hot metal. He remembered a city worker borrowing a lock. "Said theirs walked off," he said. "We had a pile. I gave him one from the bottom, probably a little old. He brought it back a week later. Said thanks. I said don't thank me, thank the taxpayers." He laughed and coughed and held out a jar of peppermints that tasted like dust and sugar. They brought the pads of prints and the little bottles of black and gray powder and dusted the binder, because sometimes you get lucky. They found a partial on the margin by the E note and sent it to the state. The state sent back a shrug and a polite letter about age and smudge and the way paper drinks oil. But even the shrug stacked on the others until the pile felt like a platform you could stand on for a second without falling through. Mara took the toy home one night. She did not log it out, she did not need to. It stayed logged in her head. She put fresh batteries in because machines need help to keep talking. She sat on her living room floor where the rug was soft because softness made hard work bearable, and she pressed play again. The little voice came, then the bell, then the rattle, then the DJ. She closed her eyes and let the waves run through her. She saw the bathhouse not as it was, but as sound said it had been, humid and cold, tile and echo, air moving in old lungs. She wrote notes on a pad. She drew the bell as 3 lines and the fan as a jagged shape and the DJ as a wave with a name. She felt for a second like she could hear the space between the sounds, the gap where a breath could fit. She pressed stop. "We're coming," she said to the empty room, to the air that still remembered. The river kept doing what rivers do, forgetting and remembering at the same time. Fog came most mornings that week and lay on the banks like a blanket you cannot kick off. The railroad crossing rang when it had to, and some nights, if you stood there with your eyes shut, you could convince yourself the notes meant something more than "train is coming." People drove by the bathhouse and did not look or looked too long and then looked away. The city council argued in a small room about budgets and locks and how much a memory costs. The father drove sometimes to the storage lot and stood at the door of the unit and did not open it. He pressed his palm against the cold roll-up door and counted to 3 and then counted to 2. 00 a.m., because now those numbers meant shape and time and hope. In the end, there was no bright star falling from the sky, no instant unraveling. There was the patient work of sound and steel and recalled words, the slow turn of a map that had been noise until someone cared enough to listen. The toy that remembered did not hold the whole story. It held a thread. And that thread led through fog to a building that breathed, to a broken wash of metal, to a bell that sang out of tune. It led to a missing padlock and a found binder, and a man who finally said what he had seen when saying it might still matter. It led to a room in a police station where a father sat with his hands around a small red and white box and held on like you hold a hand in the dark when you do know which way the stairs go. On the last night of that week, rain came soft as ash. The father set the tape recorder on the kitchen table and did not press anything. He let the house breathe. He let the refrigerator hum and the clock grind past a number that no longer made him sick, at least not every time. He rested his palm on the plastic and felt cool come up. He closed his eyes and heard a bell somewhere in the city ring 3 notes, and maybe it was the East Spur or maybe it was his mind, but either way, it was a sound that pointed. He pictured the river fog leaning against the bathhouse walls, the HVAC fan rattling its old asthma, the radio voice saying after 2 like a promise. He whispered his daughter's name, the way he had whispered it 1,000 times before. This time when the word left his mouth, it did not fall into a void. It drifted outward to the map they had made from noise and settled somewhere gentle, and for a long minute he let himself believe that the sound would reach her, like a light on the far side of a fog, steady, small, and real. Under collapsing tiles and mildew-sweet air, the pry bar bit the seam. On the third pull, the hidden door breathed. The bathhouse had learned how to keep a secret. Pink paint flaked in petals from the concrete wall, each curl a small lie told for years. The air was warm in a tired way, heavy with damp and chlorine memory, sweet like a pool long gone to sleep. Crowbars slid under the lip of a panel no blueprint admitted existed. Hands swapped out when the muscles burned. Voices stayed low, as if noise might wake something mean. Detective Hart stood near the threshold with her light steady against the grout lines, reading the room like a story that had finally decided to be told. Ruiz counted under his breath to keep the rhythm, and the father stood back with a blanket folded tight in his arms as if it might know where to go on its own. When the screws finally sheared, the panel gave with a sound like a jar of old pennies turning. Cold air slipped out and touched their faces, river wet and stale, as if the space behind the wall had been breathing through a straw. They waited, listening. The building creaked. The river whispered outside. Somewhere in the ceiling, the old fan that had rattled on tape for a decade held its peace. Hart nodded to Ruiz. They eased the panel aside and leaned it against the tiles. A second door waited, painted a childish pink that did not belong with concrete and mildew. Someone had laid the color with care, but time had lifted it in flakes until it looked like a rash. A single bulb hung on the other side of a wire mesh grate, and when Ruiz thumbed the switch, it stuttered awake, bright then dim, then bright again, as if unsure it was allowed to see. The room that should not exist opened its eye. It was smaller than anyone wanted it to be. The paint had tried hard to be cheerful and lost the fight. The air carried the sour sweet of a place that has held too much breath. A small bed sat too neatly in the back corner, made with crisp corners and a pink sheet pulled tight. A toy horse propped on the pillow with its nose touching the wall like it had been put there for punishment. A calendar was pinned to the cinder block, a cheap paper one with a lighthouse on the cover that had been turned to the wrong year, and then the next wrong year, and then the next. Days were crossed out with a steady hand. A year on that wall held months no one else had lived. "Clear," Ruiz said softly, and the word hardly made a sound. Hart moved in with 2 officers shoulder to shoulder, their beams slicing the corners. The father stayed in the doorway, the blanket heavy in his hands, his heart trying to keep up. He knew what he feared seeing. He did not know how to hold what he hoped. Hart's voice, trained to be a rope, went low and even. "Hello," she said. "Police. My name is Lena. If someone is here, I'm here to help you." Silence lay down like an animal and refused to move. She tried again. "You are not in trouble. We brought water. We brought blankets." A sound came, soft and wrong for a moment, like paper tearing. It took the shape of a breath pulled fast. The bed skirt shifted. From the space between bed and wall, a pair of eyes looked out, wide, too bright, rimmed with fear that had learned to count. Hair hung long and uneven. Cheeks had the hollow of the undersunned. The figure's mouth made nothing at first, then a small noise like the start of a name. Hart lowered her light so it would not shine straight into a face that had not seen much of the world. "Hi," she said, and did not say a name, because names can knock walls down or build them twice as high. "I'm going to sit right here on the floor so you can see me," she said, and she did, crossing her legs and placing her hands open on her knees. Through the door, the river exhaled. "Water," the girl said, but it came out like a question she had been taught not to ask. Ruiz slid a bottle across the tile and stopped it near the bed with his fingertips. The girl watched it as if it might bite. Hart waited. Waiting, she had learned, is a kind of kindness. The girl reached out with a careful hand and pulled the bottle under the bed. The sound of plastic crackling seemed too loud. She drank in short, careful sips, like she was afraid of being caught doing something good. When she reappeared, the bottle was back in its place, lined up square to a tile edge. "My name is Lena," Hart said again. "This is Joe," she gestured to Ruiz. "And out that door is your dad, he's holding a blanket for you." The girl blinked, slow and suspicious, as if the word dad were a trick. "He found your recorder," Hart said. "He listened. That's how we knew how to find this place." The girl's eyes jumped to a shelf Hart had not noticed, a low plank made of painted scrap wood. A small red-end white recorder sat there like an altar piece, its rainbow sticker peeled at the same corner as the one in the father's hands back at the beginning. Next to it, a stack of wall calendars leaned like thin bricks. October was paper-worn and thumb-greased on each. Paramedics moved in, practiced at making noise sound like hush. They brought a blanket with weight in it, the kind that tells your skin you exist, and a soft authority that filled the room without crowding it. "Hey there," a medic said in a voice that could calm storms. "We're going to check you, okay? We'll stay right here. We'll go slow." The girl watched hands and faces the way animals watch weather. When the father stepped forward with his blanket, Hart raised a palm. "1 second," she whispered, not to him but to time itself. The girl's eyes slid back to the bed, to the way the sheet sat like it was waiting for inspection. "It has to be neat," she said, and her voice carried the weight of rules. "It has to be neat when he comes." Her gaze flicked to the corner where a lock hung on a hook, not on a door. She tracked it the way people track the sun for seasons. "He won't," Hart said. "He won't be the one to come again." She flicked her eyes at Ruiz. He was already moving, already calling for the unit waiting outside. Footsteps rushed, a different kind of noise now, the kind buildings remember. The father could not hold still any longer. He bent and placed the blanket on the tile like an offering. The girl's breath changed. She slid out from the bed slow as a tide. She was taller than her mother remembered in dreams and smaller than the world had planned. The medics wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and tucked the ends like a promise. Her hands gripped the edges, and she breathed through her nose in measured rhythms, the kind you learn when someone teaches you that quiet is safer than any question. They walked her out by the easy route through the cavity behind the wall, through a door that had once looked like a column. Hart went first, the medic second, the girl third with the father beside her, his hands hovering as if touch might break a spell. He did not say her name. He did not ask if she remembered his. He matched his steps to hers and marveled at the sound of them. Outside, the fog made jewels out of the ambers on the ambulance. The girl stopped once and turned her face toward the river. She closed her eyes as if listening, and then nodded, as though the water had told her it would keep her secret a little longer until she wanted to speak it herself. The arrests began before sunrise. One man in cuffs hauled from a dark sedan that wore river silt on its wheel wells like dust. He did not run. He did not ask why. His eyes stayed flat as if this were just another stop. In his trunk they found paint the exact shade of tired pink, a box of cheap bulbs, receipts folded small and pushed under the spare tire. The ink told a story he could not unwrite. A padlock borrowed from the silo shop, cash at a hardware store the same week the bathhouse lock went missing, a gas station 2 miles from the East Spur stamped 2. 11 a.m. another man in handcuffs of his own making, found in a shed behind his house, wrists cinched tight with the zip ties he had meant for other things, ties he had looped once, twice, in a panicked practice of vanishing. The maintenance binder lay open on a workbench. Keys hung above it in neat rows, each labeled in a careful hand, each a door that should have had one key and did not. When they cut the ties, he sobbed, not from pain, but from the collapse of a lie too heavy to carry alone. The chain of complicity ran through the town like wire. It hummed in receipts with time stamps and clerk initials, in lock orders typed by a city computer that liked to freeze, in gate repairs listed as urgent by someone who did not work there anymore, in the DJ's log where a caller named Eddie requested Lighthouse 3 times that month, always after 2. It stretched through a drawer of spare keys that had never been inventoried, through a clipboard where the bathhouse apprentice had written, "Fan cage loose," and no one had signed the fix. It settled into the flat voice of the man who had driven by and seen a sedan idling and decided not to bother anyone with what might have been nothing. It smoked out in the caretaker's story about a padlock that had wandered off and wandered back like a dog. A story he had told because it was easier than saying who had asked for which key and why he had said yes. Interrogation rooms have a smell: coffee, old carpet, pencil shavings, and the heat people make when they decide whether to lie. The man in the sedan sat with his hands quiet, his gaze pinned to the camera as if it were a clock. Hart laid the receipts on the table in a line, each one a plank leading across a river. She set down the photograph of the paint flakes and then the bulb and then the lock washer found under the stairs. She did not raise her voice. She did not let her chair scrape. "Tell me which one you want to explain first," she said. He said he wanted a lawyer. She nodded. She also nodded to the camera. She knew dawn would arrive even if this room wanted to stay night. The man from the shed talked in fits and starts, a chain jerking through a tight ring. He told them about keys that were copied because the city wanted speed, and he wanted to please the men who liked to be let in without paperwork. He told them about repairs done off the books because budgets are thin and favors are softer to sign. He told them about a locksmith on the east side who kept a little red notebook where orders went when people did not want them to appear in the big blue ledger. He cried when he said the girl's name, a crack in a wall that had held too long. "I never saw her," he said. "I never saw her." The word never can look a lot like always if you turn it in the light. Hart watched his face and trusted the expressions more than the sentences. In a hospital ward that smelled like lemon and new linens, the girl sat under a warm blanket with a paper bracelet around her wrist and stared at a TV that was not on. The medics had checked her the way you check a storm cellar after years of quiet, carefully, with respect for what you might find. The nurse spoke gently and did not say the word trauma. She said, "How about juice? And you can say no, and you get to choose." The girl looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, and then placed them on top of the blanket so she could see them. The father sat in a chair that squeaked when he leaned forward. He did not lean forward. He kept still and let his breath slow until the sound of it matched hers. A therapist came and spoke about time like it was a fabric that could be sewn back together, as long as you did not rush the stitches. A doctor talked about vitamins and sleep and gentle routines, about light in the morning to reset clocks, about how bodies remember even when minds can't find the words yet. The girl asked if she could have a calendar. The nurse brought one with a picture of a lighthouse. The girl smiled at that in a way that made the room widen. She took a pen and drew a line across the day they were in. Not an X, not a strike-through, just a mark to say I was here. Back at the station, truth arrived the way dawn arrives on heavy mornings, slow and unforgiving and bright where it needs to be. Files opened. Phones rang and did not stop. The railroad sent a fresh log with a note from Willis, the conductor, saying he remembered the night he wrote Bell Sticky. The radio station pulled an archive no one thought they had and found a sound clip of the 2 a.m. call sign with a hiss that matched the hiss on the toy. The silo shop owner brought a coffee can full of old keys and said, "Take them." And when Hart poured them out, one lay on top with a pink paint smear near the head. In the room with the whiteboard map, they circled what they knew, not with triumph, with relief that felt like sorrow. The circles overlapped around a door that had finally given up its secret. They wrote down the names of men who would spend years explaining their choices in rooms where the lights never flicker. They wrote down the name of a girl who would never have to explain anything she did to survive. When they brought the father and the girl together without machines and without questions, they stood one step apart for a small eternity. He said nothing first. She looked at his face as if reading a book she had memorized and forgotten, and then she lifted one hand like someone testing rain. He held out his, palm up, the way you meet a skittish horse. Her hand landed there. It was warmer than he feared and steadier than he deserved. "I kept track," she said, tapping the air, the invisible grid of all the days she had crossed off. "I didn't know if they were the same days as yours." He nodded. "We'll make new ones," he said, simple as turning on a light. They walked to the window together and looked out at the parking lot and the small smear of river you could see between buildings if you knew where to look. The town moved, cars the size of toys, people like dots going about their mornings with umbrellas and coffee and keys they would now hold tighter. The tape had ended. It had done its work and gone quiet. The room beneath the town was no longer a room. It was a case file and a construction plan, and a place where workers would rip down tile and strip out wire and let in air. Living, messy and bright and not on schedule, began again in a hospital bed, and a kitchen and a station and a cul-de-sac that would always breathe a little differently after midnight. That night when the girl slept in a room that did not hum like a machine breathing for her, a nightlight made a small, steady circle on the wall. No cameras watched. No locks clicked. Somewhere across town, a crossing bell rang 3 notes out of tune, and the sound rolled down the blocks like a benediction that didn't need words. In the morning, the lighthouse on her new calendar would glow in the sun that found the window and warmed the pink paint on a drywall that would never hide a door. And the town, which had held its breath for so long it forgot how to exhale, let out a long, quiet breath and kept listening, not for the bad things, but for the soft sounds that mean life, simple and stubborn, is moving forward.